Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. Thanks for coming to help launch the new book by Carol Kino, her first double-click twin photographers in the golden age of magazines. She will be joined in conversation by journalist and nonfiction writer Gilbert King. My name is Salvatore Scabona, the Sue Ann and John Weinberg Director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, where you find yourselves right now. As most of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center over there. They receive access to our collections and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships, which Carol did feverishly. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work in the world today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and we are currently hosting our 25th annual class of fellows. This series presents the books that they came here to write. Carol and Gilbert were fellows together in 2019, 2020, a very funny year for most of us. Tonight they'll talk together for about 35 to 40 minutes. Then they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. A staff member will walk along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about a half an hour. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, welcome. Please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Copies of Double Click are for sale in the hall, and Carol has generously agreed to sign your copy for you. Double Click is about a pair of ambitious identical twins who, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, picked careers in photography at an auspicious time when doors for women in the field were open in a way they had never been before. And Carol Kino, I don't know what they have to say about Carol Kino. Carol, says the Journal, has interwoven a biography of the McLaughlins with an authoritative, detailed history of fashion, the art world, and photography in mid-century New York. Gilbert King is the writer, producer, and host of Bone Valley, a multi-part narrative podcast about murder and injustice in 1980 Central Florida. He's the author of 3 books, most recently Beneath a Ruthless Sun. His previous book, Devil in the Grove, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2013. Carol Kino's writing about art, artists, the art world, and contemporary culture has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, Town & Country, and many major art magazines. She was formerly a fellow at the USC Annenberg Getty Arts Journalism Program. Double Click is her first book. Please help me welcome and congratulate Carol Kino.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is really exciting for me because having done the Cullman Fellowship together with Carol, got to hear about all the research and all the excitement that she was learning, all these new things as she progressed in her research here. And now to sit here and see a bound copy in her hands, very exciting. And I get to ask her the questions. So, Carol, let's start here. How did the McLaughlin sisters come to your attention? And can you describe how you came to the decision to write Double Click based on them?
I'm going to try to encapsulate it and not go on. It was a very circuitous decision, but there was a show of one of the twins who had been the only woman in the Condé Nast studio. There was a show of her work and her husband's work. He'd been a very eminent Harper's Bazaar photographer at a gallery on 57th Street. And I have a friend who's a photography publicist, and she, I'd done a lot of stories with her. She brought it to my attention and persuaded me to somehow write 2 stories about it. And while I was doing it, I was at this stage in my career where many stories that I came across seemed to be worthy of a book or have the makings of a book in them. And this was so interesting because it was about this period when there were when refugees were flooding into New York and creating this kind of new culture with the Americans who were already here. Many people were joining together to create American culture, so that was one aspect of it that really interested me. And then while I was working on these stories, I realized there were a lot of major female American photographers who had had extremely successful careers during this period, which was the 40s, and we didn't know anything about them at all. So when it finally came time to write a book, my agent and I discussed what would make an interesting topic, and we decided this period would be interesting, and I wanted to write about women who'd been successful rather than women who'd been unsuccessful. And so we sort of hit upon the idea of a group biography of all these female photographers. So,
well, you
yeah.
made the right decision.
And then the editor who acquired it asked me if I would consider focusing on the twins. So
Right.
that's what I did. And
Was
then
that a major pivot for you? I mean, you've done all this research.
I was nervous about it, actually, because I felt, I wasn't really sure what was in their archives at that point. I hadn't really looked at them yet, and I wanted to be, as a suspicious journalist, I wanted to be free to do something else if necessary. But anyway, it worked out in the end.
Yeah,
And dramatically, it worked really well.
Yes.
To have them,
I want to talk about the beginnings. Can you talk about, the sisters' early life and their photographic beginnings? That's sort of a multi-part question because I want you to start, and also focus on, women's magazines at the time.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Wait a second, that's a really big question.
It is. Well, let's start about their photographic beginnings and
Okay.
how they got into photography.
They went to Pratt. Well, they'd always been photographed, and it was a time when cameras were, because of the Kodak Brownie, which I think was introduced in 1900, cameras were very present in American life, and it was very easy to have a camera. And even during the Depression, I was really surprised in my research to find that tons of people still had enough disposable income to buy cameras and take pictures. Like during the pandemic, there were still people with enough disposable income around to buy things and do things that we wouldn't necessarily expect them to be able to do. So they were always, because they were gorgeous, cute, and noteworthy because they were twins, they were always being photographed, and they had an aunt who was crazy about photography, and they always went to pick up her film at the drugstore every weekend, and became interested in photography that way. But then when they went to art school at Pratt, photography was just becoming an important illustrator's tool, and Pratt was it was actually the second place in America to introduce an industrial design department. So photography was introduced there as part of that department, and it was one of the first places in America to have a full-fledged photography lab. So the twins, for some reason, just decided they wanted to study photography there, and they talked their way into the department, and they just decided that's what they wanted to do with their lives.
And I mean, they were extraordinarily smart women.
Yes.
They could have probably done anything they wanted, but they chose photography.
Yes, yeah.
Can you just talk
I think,
about that?
they were always interested in the arts. They were involved in, so in school, they had been at the top of, they were at the top of their class, trading positions by a slight percentage point. And in the end, Franny, the Condé Nast twin, was the valedictorian, and her sister was the salutatorian, just because, that year she happened to be on top. But so they were really bright, and they were involved in every artistic extracurricular activity you could think of. And I think, photography, I mean, one of the early chapters of the book, I was just trying to figure out, why was photography so appealing to somebody who was young then? And I think it was just this sort of, it was scientific. It was something. I mean, you were a photographer, so you have some sense of. But it was a complicated, new kind of. It was a little scientific. I think it took hand-eye coordination to do it. It was like a sport in a way. It took some skills, but it involved design. It involved things. It was more immediate than painting was somehow.
Yeah,
So
right.
I think it was this new. I talked to Beverly. I discovered early on that Beverly Pepper, the sculptor, had been their classmate, and I was able to interview her before she died. And she said it was the thing that everyone wanted to take it because it was new. So that was, yeah.
And you talked a little bit briefly about this, but what was the world of women's magazines like in the 1930s, and how did it progress?
Like the mid to late 1930s was the introduction of the first magazine for young career women, which was Mademoiselle, and it really turned the tables on all the others by talking about, not as soon as it was introduced, but a couple of years later, it got this very savvy young female editor who was in her 30s, and she started doing makeovers and introducing stories that talked about premarital sex and, just things that obviously the young career girl and college girl readership was interested in hearing about. So this was something I had not expected when I started writing about this period. I didn't think it was going to be so sophisticated. And so, because of the 50s, I think we tend to imagine that everything that happened before the 50s, young women didn't have a thought in their heads about anything like this. And instead, I found that the 50s were a chimera and, or a brainwashing, and that actually the world that existed before that was way more like our own. So there were all these sophisticated, because everybody was competing with Mademoiselle, there were, and trying to keep up with Mademoiselle, which was setting the pace, there were all these magazines that were talking about this sort of thing with varying degrees of sophistication, I guess.
And you talk about the year 1947 as this important year.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just talk about why that was such a seminal year?
So in 1947, after the war, but I should talk about, so when the war came, do you mind if I return to this? Okay.
Please.
So when the war came, then women had to participate in the war because men went off to war and women had to fill their jobs. But what I found was there were a lot of women eager to work before that happened. I think housewives had to be persuaded to fill men's jobs, but it seemed to me from looking at magazines, this move for women to take up careers was happening definitely by the late 1930s. It might have been motivated by the Depression, I think, when women did go to work. So in 1947, before 1947, when the men came back, women were actually told through these magazines, it was something called reconversion. So the peacetime economy, the jobs women had taken were going to be turned back to men, and they were told, get ready, you're going to have to give up your job to the guy who had it before. And in 1947, this really full-on, I don't think it was through the government, as far as I can tell. It was just, I don't know, the way of the world. There was this kind of full-on assault telling women it's time to pack it up, find a man, have a baby, find a man, get married, have a baby, and and start raising the young men who are going to rebuild the world in a better way than the world we saw during the war. And it's really remarkable the degree to which this happened in the career girl magazines that had flourished so much during the war. Have we even talked about the career girl? Well, there were a lot of career girl magazines during the war, and they really kind of mounted this full-on assault against women, which was just, it really happened in 1947. It was really dramatic. Yeah.
Just before we go on further, can you just talk, Franny and Fuffy were very close.
Yeah.
But there's also like a little bit of competition that sort of seeps in there at times. And I what was their relationship like, and how did it change over time?
Well, are you talking about the man they both dated?
Oh, not yet. We'll get to them too. I'm just talking about their early personalities.
I found it kind of hard to discern because I think they were so close. I sort of feel they must have noticed when they were both in school and one of them did better than the other. They must have been aware of that. People who knew them say they were always very close and there was no competition. But then, people who were close to them would tell me that. But then people who knew them, like curators and editors who worked with them, told me, they used to have fights on the phone. And so it's, but I think they were very close and very helpful to each other over the years. But there must have just been this, because they were twins, there must have just been this back and forth, pulling and tugging that must have been as natural to them as breathing is my impression of them, basically. I don't get the impression that there was ever a huge rift, but, maybe barbed comments by one about the other not to her face, but behind her back kind of thing.
But you sort of get a sense that one of the photographers will get a more prestigious assignment.
Oh, yes.
And it will affect the decisions that the other...
Yeah. So there was this terrible... but I don't know that it was a rift between them. So, as they came out into the real world and finished school, they'd always kind of done everything in tandem, and people had been prepared to promote them as twins and see them kind of as a two-headed being, I guess. And then as they started working, one of them would get a better job than the other, but they still kind of accompanied each other on jobs. It's very interesting to, even as they rose in more and more prestigious jobs, they would go with each other to shoots and do things together. It's really fascinating. So then there was a terrible rift, or not a rift, but there was a terrible change in their lives when Franny was hired as the only woman in the Condé Nast studio. And it's really hard to know if she was the only person sent for the interview. It wasn't like they were both sent and one was chosen, but it's really hard to know if she was sent because of her talent over her sister's talent, or if that was just chance,
Right.
And then that propelled her sister, whose nickname was Fuffy and whose byline is Catherine. It's really hard. Anyway, that propelled her to leave her job, which was quite a good job, and become a really successful freelance photographer. So
yeah, I wonder if they just raised each other's games. The
I
early
think so.
part where you're talking about one's the valedictorian and one misses it by like a quarter of a point. It's
it's just so hard. It's so hard to know. And I don't fully believe everyone who said to me, no, there was no competition. it's really hard to think they weren't aware.
Yeah.
You know, it's
One of the other themes, and we're going to get to the men in a minute because I know people want to hear about that. But
it's really
one of the themes in Double Click is feminism.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk to us about your thoughts on feminism as it relates to the story that you're telling here.
Yeah. That's another big question.
I got big questions.
Wait a second, refine it a little bit, can you? Well, I guess the underlying theme of the book is, there are many underlying themes of the book.
They really are.
Wait, Gilbert, give me a little bit more. That's a really broad, open-ended question.
Yeah, we can go back to that. I think actually what I'll start with is, maybe this will spur you on. Watch
Okay,
that.
fine.
The men in the lives of Fanny and Fuff
Franny.
figure prominently in
Yeah.
in Double Click. You have to talk about their shared boyfriend Jimmy.
Right. I know. I've been surprised that nobody has mentioned the other husband, but
We're going to get to him next. 'Cause
Okay,
I'm
fine.
interested in him, but
okay, fine.
Jimmy is
great,
fascinating.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I've been so surprised that I guess I'm really naive to be surprised that he's the person who's come up the most in interviews. So they had one of the first people they met when they were in college. They were discovered by this magazine, College Bazaar, which I had to go to great lengths. That's one of my first projects in the library, was to figure out what this magazine was that they were talking about, which did not seem to be in any library anywhere. And one of the librarians here helped me figure out where it was. Anyway, so it was the precursor to Junior Bazaar, which was Harper's Bazaar's brief junior magazine, a brief, short-lived junior magazine. But they had their first photographs published there, and they modeled for it once. And the photographer was this on-the-rise young star who worked for Harper's Bazaar and Town and Country and places like that. And he was fabulously good-looking and on his way to a divorce. And then they met up with him again very soon after they got out of school and were out in the world working, and they all started dating. And he, I was thinking about it today, and I think part of his appeal, as well as him being fabulously good-looking and sophisticated, was that he was a great photographer. Right. I don't think they were going to have been interested in, when they were in high school, they were interested in Yaleys, but I think by this point they had moved on, and they were also interested in Boys from Choate, but which was the prep school in their town. But by this time, I think they were really interested in photographers and photography, and so there's this fascinating series of love letters and flirtatious notes that they both wrote him together, and then they wrote some separately to him. I don't know if each sister knew she was, the other one was writing him letters from a different address. It was so amazing when I developed this thing when I was in the archives of scanning first and then reading later. And when I sat down and read these letters, they were mind-boggling. Anyway, but the letters, as well as being like incredibly flirtatious and, things like, which twin has lost 5 pounds since you've been gone, or has gained 5 pounds, I think, since you've been gone, and and which one is pining away for love of you? So, but they were also filled with all these photography in-jokes, which weren't worth decoding for the book, because you would have had to read up on all of the photography teachers of the time, but it was so funny that they were making jokes about photography. It was really great.
How did that relationship with Jimmy end? How did that play out?
Well, he married one of them. And he was always trying to decide, was it his decision? he was always trying to decide which twin he should marry, and he had a therapist who was, I heard this from everyone I interviewed, Jimmy was trying to decide. I heard this from the very first day I started talking to people about them. Jimmy was always trying to decide which twin he should marry. And I actually heard from from his daughter, he was trying to decide even when he was in his 60s, did I marry the right one? Which was so awful. But would Franny have married him? I'm not, I think it's really debatable that I think she met the right man and married him.
And
he was a different person.
Right. And you're talking about Leslie Gill.
I am,
and
yes.
you describe him, as the romantic hero of the book.
Yes.
So
yes.
Tell us more about
Yeah, I can't believe that nobody has picked up on this great photographer. He was a genius photographer of his time. The only reason we do not talk about him in the same breath as Irving Penn and Hero, both of whom he influenced and inspired, is because he died really young, and he died before, and he was modest, and he wasn't the type of photographer who would claim the mantle of genius, I think, but when he died, there were trade magazines devoted to his work, and plenty of quotes about his genius, which I put in the book. But a lot of the way magazine photography looks now is due to his influence, I think. So he was, a really inspiring and important photographer, and deserves to be recognized now. And I think and he was also, just when I interviewed people about him, he had 2 daughters from his first marriage, and there were other people I interviewed about him, and people were practically in tears as they talked about him still. So he was supposed to be an incredibly likable, sweet, modest, hilariously funny, nobody could say anything. He could do no wrong kind of person. So anyway, and he seems to have adored Franny, the Condé Nast photographer, for herself, and not worrying about which sister he should have chosen.
Must have been refreshing.
So,
can you also talk about the sexism that they faced in this career?
Yeah, I think it was. It was subtle. I think if you were, they achieved so much, and they definitely had their entree at a time when there was a lot of room for women to rise, because the men had gone off to war in the early parts of their careers. But women, it was very hard for women to get covers. So Franny, the Condé Nast one, could do many of the shoots on the inside of Glamour, and Fuffy, Fuffy's big thing was when she became a freelancer, she started working for Charm, which was a competitor to Glamour. So Glamour was a competitor to Mademoiselle, and then Charm was a competitor to Glamour. And so Fuffy worked for Charm, and she could do 2/3 of the photos inside of Charm and not get the cover. They gave the covers to men. So Franny, who was at Condé Nast, had a few covers, but they were few and far between. She could do most of the back-to-school college issue, and Irving Penn would get the cover. And she did a lot of really great photos, but often they were run at thumbnail size. So it just, you were only going to get so far if you were a woman, I think. And then after the war, in the Condé Nast studio, where they had great cameras, huge resources, and they were so when Alex Lieberman became art director of Vogue and then gradually took over all the other magazines, he really built out the Condé Nast studio, and he hired all of these young Americans to sort of create this young American vision. And one of the things that happened after the war was that they were all supposed to experiment and stretch themselves. And I think there's this series of photos that we put in the book. We put a couple of examples in the book of Franny's photos of Carmen del Orifice. And I'm sure these are some of her experiments, and they're gorgeous, and they never got published. And a lot of the men's experiments did get published. So that's some of the sexism.
Yeah.
I've got plenty more examples. But,
I know, you can get them in the book.
Right, yeah, right, get the book.
This is a question I often ask of my fellows at Cullman. Your story it begins at the, dawn of World War II. The world is facing this, calamity. And while you're working on this here at the Cullman Fellowship, we're in a different calamity, COVID.
Yeah.
What was that experience like for you? I'm just really curious.
Well, it was so weird because I realized as I was writing the book, I was writing about the creation of all these edifices of the 50s, which were being dismantled as I was writing about them. And then when we left the Cullman Center, I was having to write about the creation of Midtown Manhattan at a time when people were saying New York is over. Midtown Manhattan had been emptied out. It was horrible. And I really had to gin up a lot of courage to do that. And I'd been in other cities that had been decimated by various things. San Francisco, after the earthquake, when I had a terrible personal, my house was destroyed by the fire in 1989, and and that city had come back, so I had to feel. I mean, I'd seen cities come back, but the COVID seemed really a different situation.
Yeah.
So it was.
It's hard enough to write through these contentious elections, but then you have something like that.
Yes,
it's like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, and there was the political upheaval going on at the same time. It was like, will we even have places left to publish anything? Anyway, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Make it a little happier now. You told me that you thought a lot about novels while you were working on this, and I'm just, I know you loved your experience here at the Cullman, and we're surrounded by novelists.
Yeah.
What kind of books were you reading? What did you take away from them?
I wasn't reading them at the time, but they were novels that I'd read when I was much younger. So I was thinking, there were these periods, so this sort of relates to the sexism in a way, I guess. There were places in the book where, places in the twins' interviews where, which had been conducted by other people, of course, where Fuffy, for instance, says, Franny and I always used to talk about Louise Dahlwolf, who was the primary woman photographer at Harper's Bazaar, and how her husband was so great to her and treated her like a queen, did everything for her. And then Toni Furcell, who when they started was the primary woman at Vogue, and how her husband, always made her come home from Europe and, threatened to sell the house if she didn't stop her, gallivanting in Europe. And so they were clearly looking at all these other women and the different possibilities for their lives. And it just seemed like it came from, that passage in their interviews seemed like it came from novels that I used to read when I was in college, or even younger when I was a child, pretty much. So Margaret Drabble's A Summer Birdcage was something I read when I was really young because my parents bought it. I still have their Penguin copy. And it's, it's Margaret Drabble's first novel, and it's about a young woman whose sister gets married and she doesn't want to, and she's just looking at all of the possibilities for women in their lives. And then the group is something else I think about. I think it's the graduating class of Vassar in 1933, and all these women go in different directions. So that's something I was thinking about, and anyway, things like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is, you're a first-generation American, and Double Click includes stories of a lot of refugees and emigres. And did you think about your own parents and your own situation?
Totally.
While you were doing this?
Yeah. So the thing that was so interesting about these magazines to me, especially the young women's magazines, was that all of these refugees were flooding in from Europe and working on these, coming to work in American magazines. And Glamour, especially, and these young working girl magazines, but especially Glamour, was Condé Nast's pet project that he created from scratch himself about the American working girl. And every time some European refugee would come over, he would hand them his maquette and say, "What do you think?" And sometimes he got an aristocrat, like Philippe de Montebello's uncle, who used to run the Met. His uncle came over and he said to him, "What do you think? What do you think the American working girl wants?" So this isn't quite what you asked, but I think this is so funny. And then Alex Lieberman came over who had been the managing editor of View, which was one of the magazines that influenced Life magazine. So he handed it to him and said, "What do you think?" And he rejected all these ideas, but then when Alex Lieberman was in a position to control Glamour, he was fascinated by it because, the American everyone wanted to have their say about what the American working girl wanted, which and they weren't American and they didn't really know. But that's also why this 40s period was so interesting, because American working girls finally did come into the ascendant. So one of the reasons I got so interested in this period is because my parents are English and my father was originally Australian, and I grew up thinking, what is, what is a real American? And that's a persistent question for many of these people through this book. In the beginning of the book, the American artists the twins study with are all trying to hammer out what is an American art. The photographers they study with are, discussing what is American photography, and then they're trying to figure out, what is an American magazine, what is American fashion. It's just like this figuring out of the American identity, and that's all I used to think about was, what is American? What is American? It's this great mystery of the ages, and it's always changing, I think. Anyway.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, because you had a treasure trove of research that you got from the Pratt Photo Department. Was that totally unexpected? Can you describe what you found?
A treasure trove of research from the
Pratt Photo Department.
Oh God, it turned out that all of certainly at the beginning of my book was all original. Turned out to have to be original research. So I went to Pratt and asked them, how did your photo department begin? And they said, "You're welcome to look through the school newspaper, the faculty minutes, the catalogs, and the yearbooks." So I ended up scanning and digitizing all of these things with my phone. And there were so many... there were so many things like, and then I called all of these photo scholars who said things like, "Oh, Pratt, that's really interesting. Nobody's studied that yet. How did we overlook that?" So Pratt was the first big stumbling block, and it's really interesting. Somebody should write a thesis on it. I mean, there are so many other things like that would repay further study. I have a lot of the material for. But yeah, so it got a bit better after the war, but like what happened in Montauk with the avant-garde during the war? Because they had a house, Catherine's husband, the photographer, the sexy lensman, is one of the one of the phrases I used to describe him with in the book, which has been repeated in some reviews. He had a house, the first house on a stretch of the old Montauk Highway, and like what happened there during the war? Nobody's, as far as I could tell, nobody's really documented it. So there was. Anyway,
yeah.
It's mind-boggling, the stuff that, what happened in New York City? How was the news broken to New York in the newspapers? Remember when I was going through all those extra editions? There were no extra editions in New York City. I found that out after months of searching.
Wow.
Yeah, how did we find out about Pearl Harbor? Not through an extra edition.
Really? Wow.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, let's just talk about that. We're going to open it up to questions. We'll have some cards coming here soon from the audience. But what was your research like here at the Cullman, the archival research that you did? Because I remember just you being so excited in the room back there. So.
I think at one point Paul brought me a whole lot of Montgomery Ward catalogs, and I was really thrilled about that. So at one point, one of the twins worked for Montgomery Ward, and I had tried. If you're in these circles, there's a well-known photo by one of the twins of somebody she was working for taking a photo, and I identified the photo she was taking, which was for a Montgomery Ward catalog. So I had Paul, who just brought the cards up. Paul helped us with our research, and he was often chasing down incredibly insane things for me like that. And one of the things I did was I really made it my business to learn how to research. Well, I can't research as well as a librarian, but I'm pretty good at tracking down all sorts of insane things
I know that.
at this point. So,
Sexy lensman, that's all I can remember.
it's amazing how once people hear that, they're not interested in the great, noble photographer. They just want to hear about it's so disappointing.
Well, we do have a Jim question here from one of the audience members. He was a commercial photographer. He also taught at Pratt Institute.
Yes, he did.
Did your research reveal why he gave it up?
Oh, yeah. He, interestingly, I think a lot of the people who were commercial photographers, as commercial photography got more commercial and more art directed and more pressurized, this is part of the reason he gave it up. I think, and then as certain people got acclaimed as geniuses, I don't know, it got sort of harder to be in the business. But he specifically gave it up, and other people who were a lot of other people gave it up too, but he gave it up and went into he became an art dealer. He dealt in early American antiques and furniture, and actually became a really renowned and respected dealer. And there's a lot of these people collected early American art and antiques. My characters, or my people, collected them, and there's a really famous painting that also plays a part in the book that he sold and resold several times. So
he was a sexy art dealer.
Yeah. I think by that time he wasn't as sexy, I've heard. He was just a candy art dealer.
Okay. Here's a question. Can you talk about what the women photographed, both in work life and in private life?
In work life, during this period, Franny was doing fashion and personalities, and she continued, later on she got into film, and she did a lot of work on film sets, and she made films as well. And then Fuffy, or Catherine, did fashion during this period, but when she had children by 1948, I think, And she had to stop taking assignments for a while, and then she segued into taking photos of her children and then marketing her children to, not her children, marketing the photos of her children and her friends' children. She developed a business in taking photos of children and naturalistic photos of children, and became an incredibly successful photographer of children. So, and especially multiples as well, quintuplets, triplets, sextuplets, I don't know. She was a really successful photographer too, and I think they had a business together for a while, a photo agency of some sort, but I didn't go into that anyway. And in their private lives, I mean, that's one of the things that was so alluring about them is they were taking photos constantly. They had cameras around their necks, and their friends were really attractive people. So they were friends with Lisa Fonsegrive-Penn, who's a supermodel, tons of photos of her in their archives. Mia Fonsegrive-Solo, her daughter, but like any interesting design or photography person you can think of, they were taking photos of them because they were friends with them. So
yeah, I really like some of the street photography that they were doing early in their
yes.
career.
Sorry, I forgot that. They both were really into street photography, and it looks so contemporary that that was the other thing that attracted me to it. A lot of it looked like it could have been taken today.
Yeah.
And the fashion from the 40s, this period, is our fashion. It's ponchos, it's leotards, it's what we wear now. It's so interesting. So
This was a good segue to this question. Would you talk about the artistic achievement in their work? How are they going to be remembered?
yeah, I hope they're going to be remembered more now that I've written about them. I think they should. I think they wouldn't have been remembered much. Franny had all of these. She actually was the first person to do many things at Vogue, and just has not really been acknowledged for those things. Like she did the first Dior cover. She was the first woman to do a shoot the Paris collections for Vogue. And she's done many photos, important photos like Bush Sr. and his family, Deanne and Alan Arbus, things that, everybody knows but doesn't know it was her. And I think Fuffy has too. I mean, I recognized a lot of her children's photos from my childhood when I saw them. But I think they did this particularly naturalistic kind of, it was this very naturalistic kind of photography. But I don't know, people are looking for achievements. So I would say those were their achievements. But it's this, they just had great eyes,
Yeah.
They really did. And Fuffy's street photography is really fantastic, but not a lot of that has been seen or shown, and it's all stashed in her storage space.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, yeah. I hope it'll be seen more. I mean, yeah. She did a lot of graffiti. I mean, they both were into graffiti and street stuff, just in different ways.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
And it sounded like they did a lot of stuff in their private life. It wasn't all just commercial
Yes,
work.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
This question might be hard to answer, but let's try it. What do you think the twins' career would be today, given the collapse of magazines?
God, I don't know, because I know it more from a writer. I know the collapse of magazines more from a writer's perspective than a photographer's perspective. They would probably go into advertising, I would think. But I don't know what it's been for photographers. I just don't know. Because Franny definitely did a lot of advertising later on. When her husband died, she took over he was doing Bud or Miller High Life or something. A lot of the, in Mad Men, that whole beer commercial segment, I think, was kind of based on his photography, I think. And she took over that account from him when he died. And I think she'd just go into that, or something to do with movies. So
Yeah, it's hard to.
I think they could easily, they were such survivors and they were. So one of the questions I got,
go ahead.
One of the questions I got up when I was trying to figure out how did these cameras work, somebody put me in touch with somebody who was supposed to help me, and he immediately said, "Oh, so they were rich, right?" And I'm still steaming about that. Like, no, they weren't. They're ostensibly the reason they were working was their mother had lost everything in the Depression, or lost most of everything. Their mother was widowed, and there's this constant refrain in their interviews, we had to work. And, so they were real survivors. They worked till the bitter end, and which I think is admirable.
Yeah, oh, they really did.
Yeah.
I love this question. Some speculation for you, but it'll be fun. Who do you imagine playing the twins in the movie miniseries?
So many people have come up with people for me, and they've all gone straight out of my head.
Well,
somebody with really dark hair, or who can do a dye job well.
Well, this questioner says probably one actress playing both as Patty Duke.
That's what my agent has in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know.
I guess you could do that with CGI or something like that.
Yeah.
It's easier to do today.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know.
Wouldn't it just be? Yeah, I would think so.
But it is. I could see this as a very visual story. Obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm sure if that were to happen, I would have not a whole lot of say.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not even worth speculating.
Sure. Go ahead. Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, the book is really fascinating, and the story is really fascinating, and the material, their photographs are really important. Has ICP in New York or C/O in Berlin? Of course, it's not Berlin usually, they've had shows about early East German
Yeah.
women photographers.
Yeah.
Actually, my Berlin gallerist represents one of them who's passed away, the foundation, but it would be really a perfect, I personally would love to see this work in person.
Yeah. I think Howard Greenberg is going to do, when I do my book signing and reading there, I think he's going to do a mini selection. I think he's going to, Margie would know, sitting in the front row, would know a little more about that because she represents him. Anyway, but ICP is going through its own things at the moment, so I don't know what's happening with them. But I did a presentation for APAD the other day, so who knows what's going to happen. APAD is the Photography Dealers Association, and who knows? Who knows?
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Thank you for that, though. That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just one more last question, I think. And by the way, Carol is going to be out there signing books afterwards. So if you do that, we'll be here.
Okay.
Um,
And I have bookmarks to give away.
Bookmarks. This question I ask a lot of writers because I'm just always curious about their answers. But was there anything that just totally surprised you or shocked you in your research that you just weren't expecting? Something that you came across?
There were multiple things.
Multiple things?
Yeah. I think that women were that there was this hunger among women to, there's this scene in the book when the war began that women eagerly signed. It wasn't just the men who signed up to volunteer, after Pearl Harbor, in New York at least. It was not just men who volunteered, it was women who went crazy volunteering to such a degree and they volunteered for things like, they wanted to volunteer to drive ambulances, to fly planes, and to do stuff for which the military felt they were not qualified. So the military and other groups sent out all these news briefings saying, women, get back to your station, essentially, And there were all of these stories published saying, women, please sign up for clerical jobs or nursing jobs, don't. And then they started instituting a driving test because they couldn't believe, women would actually drive or would drive safely. But it seems to me there was a real hunger among women by this point to do something other than just, but they actually had numbers signing up to roll bandages more than they'd had during the First World War. The numbers of volunteers just exceeded anything they'd seen before. So that says to me that women really wanted to do something other than sitting around at home. And I hadn't expected that, because the story you hear is that, I don't know, they did have to convince housewives to come and work in factories, but women obviously wanted to do something else, and obviously wanted to do something more than, the same old thing. And also the degree of sexual sophistication that was, there was that wonderful Ladies' Home Journal poll that I was so stunned when I found that. It was when Ladies' Home Journal, which used to be #1, was it had slipped to 2 or 3, and it was trying to get sophisticated again. And Jimmy, the sexy lensman, was one of their cover photographers, along with Man Ray and Steichen. Anyway, but they did all of these polls about what does the American woman think? And one of their polls was about sex before marriage, and was it okay, since it was so difficult to get married after at the tail end of the Depression, since there wasn't enough money to set up a household, was sex before marriage okay between committed couples? And it was so interesting, because it was something like almost 30%? You've just reread the book.
Like 30-something, yeah.
Yeah, it was divorced women felt fine, and single women felt, it was some high percentage of, older women, maybe it wasn't okay. And then they asked them questions like, is petting okay? And things like that. And they had all of these funny interviews where they said things like, they talked to some woman in Ohio, and she said, oh yes, everybody does it. And her date called out, yelled to the interviewer through the phone, oh yeah, we're all doing it. I was just stunned. It was the late 30s by then.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. So if you, grew up thinking the 50s defined American womanhood up until our time, that wasn't true at all. That was a revelation. That was really interesting. They pulled the wool over our eyes, which is always... And when I went to... So Fuffy's photos, I'm just going to take one more minute. Fuffy's photos of children, beautiful children and their mothers. When I went to see them in her son's house, her son happens to live 10 minutes away from where I grew up. I grew up in Stanford. He lives in Palo Alto. When I went to see them, I recognized a lot of these photos from ads that I'd seen growing up. And I thought, and they were of people like all of these famous models, children, and so on. And, these bohemian people who'd all been naked on the beach in Montauk with them. And I thought, I always knew that was a lie. It was so great. I was so excited.
That's so funny.
Anyway, that can be my final word on the book.
I think that's a great one. This is Carol Kino. The book is called Double Click. She'll be out there signing books. Thank you, Carol. That was great. Great way to end it.
It's true. I didn't know it was a lie, but all of that Dick and Jane stuff.